This is a Beargrass Baptist Church Black History Moment, leaning on the Lord. Today we are celebrating the 144th anniversary of the founding of our church. It was in February of 1880, just 15 years after slavery had legally been abolished. The times were very hard and most dangerous for African Americans, yet the work of the Lord had to be done. Initially, 5 or so men comprised the membership of the church. The first sermon they heard was "The Sword of the Lord and of Gideon" from Judges chapter 7, verse 18, preached by Reverend Elijah Preston Mars, the minister selected as their pastor. It is remarkable that these inspired men speaking the words of the Lord were able to grow the church membership to the point of building a church house whose cornerstone was placed 10 years later in 1890. Our church became the first African American church in the Clifton and Crescent Hill communities. Typically, when church anniversaries are held, the work of the ministers are highlighted. This is to be expected because our congregation is indebted to the work of remarkable ministers who have been our spiritual leaders and guides. On this occasion, we would like to applaud their wives who stood by their side and helped in the Christian advancement and growth of our church. Their names are Mrs. Betty Mars, Mrs. Minnie Lewis, Mrs. Barbara Ward, Mrs. Hannah Winstead, Mrs. Edna Mae Saunders, Mrs. Ella Owens, Mrs. Anna Sullivan, Mrs. Lillian Purvis, Mrs. Gloria Bishop, Mrs. Pauline Brown, Mrs. Eula Wood, Mrs. Ruth Duncan, Mrs. Patricia White, Mrs. Carolyn Hinkle, and Mrs. Joanne Smizer. And while flowers are being given out, our most unsung and unnamed heroes/heroines, who over the years have made all things possible in our church, are now applauded. These include the bus drivers, Sunday school teachers, janitors, choir directors, and members, trustees, deacons, secretaries, clerks, musicians, youth leaders, ushers, nursery staff, nurses, culinary workers, groundskeepers, and associate ministers. From 1880 to now, our church members know and deeply connect with the words of the song, "We've come this far by faith." We are leaning on the Lord, trusting in His holy word, because He has never failed us yet. We continue to walk by faith and not by sight. This has been a Beargrass Black History Moment.